제가 묻었네요.
Hi, it's me, and welcome to this overview and guide on how to use the Liu Association identities in Limbus Company. The Limbus Company Liu Association IDs are all modeled after the burn status effect, which is unfortunately one of the weakest status effects outside of the mirror dungeons. At the end of the turn, characters who have burn will take damage equal to its potency, and then the count will reduce by 1. The main issue that burn has at the time of recording is there simply aren't enough identities that use it, with there only being one that isn't part of the Liu Association. At the time of recording, there are 4 IDs that fit into this category: Liu Association South Section 6 Mere Salt, Liu Association South Section 6 Gregor, Liu Association South Section 5 Honglu, and Liu Association South Section 4 Ishmael. The only one of these IDs that isn't surprisingly solid is Gregor, but all of them have a useful role in various teams you can build. Now that the basics have been covered, let's go over each of them individually. As stated earlier, Gregor is the weakest member of the Liu Association. He has the least HP and the worst clash strength out of all of the Liu IDs, and is the only Liu ID that doesn't feel one of his own ego. His strengths lie in being able to inflict the highest amount of burn potency out of any ID in the game by quite a bit. In fact, his first and third skills do nothing except for inflicting burn. His first skill has one of the very bad roll ranges of 4 to 8, but his third skill actually deals a good amount of damage, and his clash strength is helped out a bit by him having an above average offense level. That being said, neither skill is anything special apart from Perfected Palm Strike being a rare 4-coin skill. The only effect that isn't inflicting burn in his kit is found on Rushdown, his second skill. If the third coin lands a hit and the enemy has 6+ burn, Gregor will gain 1 attack power up next turn. This helps him with his clashing issue, but it still isn't that much more reliable to increase your final roll by 1. His passive, Ignition, helps him inflict more burn potency with his second and third skills, making the third and subsequent coins inflict 1 burn on landing a hit, and it's a pretty easy passive to activate. This is one of the big reasons that Greg is the best at inflicting burn potency, and allows Rushdown to activate itself and makes Perfected Palm Strike inflict up to 8 burn at once. The support passive, Rushing Heart, increases the damage dealt with the third and subsequent coin by 30% for the slowest ally. While normally damage passives like these aren't worth much, this one is quite the niche with teams that for an occasional large burst of additional damage. I would say that any team capable of activating it isn't going to find another support passive on Gregor that is more useful. Honglu is notable for being the best inflictor of burn count in the entire game. He isn't necessarily great at inflicting burn potency, and his damage output isn't the greatest, but he's by far the best supporter in the faction. His ability to maintain enemy burn is reliant on him being able to stay at high SP, which his first skill helps quite a bit with. Skills that increase SP passively like this are pretty rare, so that one in itself is noteworthy. It's also the only member of the Liu that has a Gloom skill, which is more important than you'd think. Flowing Flame is the best applicator of burn count in the game, inflicting up to 3 while at high sanity. The skill itself is otherwise unremarkable, with a 6 to 10 roll range and no other important effect aside from inflicting burn count. Crimson Blaze Fist, his third skill, not only helps to keep his SP high, but also can inflict burn count if the enemy already has burn, which is pretty useful. The second coin also deals 30% stagger damage if the target has 6+ burn. This is mostly useful in boss fights, where it's easy to make sure an enemy has a high amount of burn, but Honglu by himself is unlikely to make use of this. Overall, it's a useful effect to have. His passives both inflict additional burn count while at high SP. Whether you're using Honglu in the party or keeping him on the bench for a support passive, this is going to be what you rely on to inflict burn count. Unfortunately, it isn't possible to force this effect to activate for somebody who actually uses burn, but hopefully that will change with time. Hong Liu is also capable of fueling his own base ego, Land of Illusion. You aren't likely to be using this more than once during a fight that isn't set in a dungeon, but it's a great AoE attack that also helps to keep Honglu's sanity topped off in case he's struggling to win clashes in the current fight. Mere Salt's Liu ID is the tankiest and slowest of the bunch, and he specializes in being able to inflict burn across multiple enemies, which is pretty situational. That being said, this is one of the stronger burn IDs in the game for the time being. His first skill, Assault, doesn't really reflect this in any meaningful way. Every Liu skill 1 basically just inflicts a small amount of burn and doesn't do much else, so there really isn't much for me to comment about it. Stalwart Stance spreads burn across 2 random enemies if the target already has 6 burn. Due to Mersault being slow, as long as the rest of the team is also inflicting burn, this is pretty likely to activate. The skill also inflicts a good 3 burn by itself, so it definitely has its uses. Perfected Death Fist is one of the best offensive Liu skills, being able to roll up to 14, and is capable of inflicting +3 burn count to a single enemy as well. It also has a similar burn spreading effect to Stalwart stance, allowing you to deal a decent amount of damage should it be able to activate. His passives are both pretty underwhelming. Inflicting burn to the attacker isn't something that will often be helpful because you don't really want to be hit, and allowing the slowest team member to inflict +1 burn really isn't something that is likely to matter as long as we don't have a lot of burn IDs. The real reason that Mersault is so good is that he perfectly fuels his own capote. Not only is it one of the cheapest heat ego in the game, but it is also capable of inflicting a ton of burn across all enemies with only a single hit. Not only that, but it also inflicts tremor equal to the target's burn, guaranteeing 7 tremor due to it inflicting 7 burn from its own effect, but also burst tremor, inflicting +2 burn count to 5 random enemies if the burst staggered the target. That isn't likely to happen due to the nature of tremor bursts unless you're running him in a tremor team, which you can do, but it is still a nice effect to have. The skill itself also increases the power of all of his non-ego skills by 1 next turn and speeds him up with haste, plus the passive increases his power just a little more if he's being targeted a lot. Overall, just a fantastic single target ego that effectively serves as a skill 4 for this ID. Lastly, we have the newest identity in the game and the strongest attacker for the Liu Association, Ishmael. While this ID is strong enough to be included into any team you want, it does need support from other burn IDs to really shine. Firstly, neither of her passives are particularly useful due to burn count being rather rare at the moment, and they will only really see any use inside of the mirror dungeons as a result. There isn't really much else to say about them. Both of her first 2 skills gain coin power if the target is above a certain burn threshold. These can actually activate mid-attack, so if the first coin causes the enemy to go above the burn threshold, the next coins will gain their +1 bonus. Frontal Assault by itself is one of the strongest wrath attacks in the game, and is even capable of inflicting burn count to enemies who already have a lot of burn. It's going to be your primary damage dealing and clashing attack in almost every situation. Inner Gate Elbow Strike doesn't gain coin power when the enemy has burn, but if they have 6+ burn and burn count, it becomes one of the hardest hitting skills in the game. It also inflicts burn count by itself. Plus coin boost is gained if the last coin causes the target to be staggered or killed, which effectively gives all of her coins +1 power on flipping heads. This is really strong for her, being a character who already has a lot of coins, but it is a little bit inconsistent to activate. Regardless, this third skill is excellent at dealing damage. It's also worth noting that her counter skill inflicts 1 burn count on hit. You aren't likely to use her counter, but she's bulky enough to be able to use it a couple of times per fight. Ishmael also has the unique ability of being able to offer speed control, since her ID perfectly fuels Roseate Desire. The attack itself is underwhelming, it is only a positive coin skill when corroded for some reason, but the passive is a really important effect in this case. Pink Ribbons will multiply itself just by allowing the enemy to flip coins, and will inflict bind equal to the stack at the end of each turn. This is the best source of enemy speed control in the game, but giving yourself haste is usually more effective. This ID also is capable of perfectly fueling Ardor Blossom Star. This is one of the strongest single target ego in the game for damage, and even deals 40% stagger damage to boot. It inflicts a lot of burn based on your Wrath Resonance and isn't restricted to just burning the target either. After it's been used, Ishmael also becomes able to spread small amounts of burn across the enemy team by attacking burned targets. I actually don't recommend ever using the corroded version since it damages you and you're more likely to be at higher sanity anyways. All of the Liu Association IDs share the ability to generate Wrath and Lust resources, meaning any effects that trigger off of Wrath or Lust resonance are very valuable in a team featuring them. Here are all of the ego that require both Wrath and Lust to be used that I haven't already mentioned. A good deal of these ego, as well as a few others, are also capable of inflicting a fair amount of burn. All of the 4th match Flame ego are able to inflict burn, with 2 of them giving the user passive burn infliction through their passive, and Don Quixote's Lifetime Stew also uniquely inflicts burn count. I want to take a moment to highlight Ishmael's other ego here because they all provide quite a good boost to any party and are easily fueled using the Liu identities in a team with each other. Snag Harpoon is valuable because of its ability to increase your power in a clash. In a burn team, you probably aren't going to use it more than once unless absolutely necessary, so you'll be able to save your gloom resources for passives and Honglu's base ego at that point. More importantly is Capote, which inflicts a small amount of burn and deals some sanity damage, but the actual use is being able to amplify your team's wrath damage output. When corroded, this will spread across the entire field and even inflict wrath fragility to enemies, so it's a very good skill to boost team-wide damage in wrath setups. The passive also helps Ishmael deal finishing damage to a variety of enemies, but isn't very noteworthy by itself. While I did attempt to build around these IDs for this guide, they are more useful at being able to modularly fit into other teams for the time being. There's no shortage of good IDs that these ones work well with, and this team is far from perfect. To start, the most important support passives are N-Corp Faust's Whistling and She Heathcliff's Self-Neglect. Keeping your sanity high is one of the most valuable effects. This is a Lust team, you've heard this before. Wrath Resonance is also very easy to activate for this team, so increasing the damage dealt during Wrath Resonance makes Heathcliff an auto-include. Leaving Honglu on the bench allows others to inflict more burn count and is my preferred way to keep enemy burn count high, but there's a number of ways to do that if you bring him along as well, so don't feel obligated to use him for his support passive. N-Corp Sinclair's support passive is also at least functional in this team, since most of your damage is going to be blunt focused if you're using the Liu, but this is mostly here because none of his other supports are particularly useful in this team setup. If you're bringing Gregor in the active party, you'll want a little bit of Gloom to bring with simply because Suddenly One Day is his only reliable skill for winning clashes. It's also the only base ego that inflicts burn, not that it does so reliably. I brought Rosespanner Rhodia along because being able to generate Pride and Gloom is incredibly helpful. It allows Mersault to be able to use Screw Loose Wallop for its 20% damage bonus from Surgery, but more importantly, Rhodia's 4th Match Flame is relatively cheap to corrode into an AoE, which inflicts a lot of burn as well as wrath fragility to enemies, upping your damage output significantly. Chef de Cuisine Ryoshu was a pretty easy include as well due to her high damage potential. Forest for the Flames is also very easy to use in this party, and both her and Ishmael both perfectly fuel Red Eyes Open, which is a high rolling AoE attack for when you might need it. She also brings healing effects through both her ego and passive to help keep the team alive in tougher encounters. One thing I struggled with was being able to use every ego available. For example, Red Eyes requires Gluttony, which isn't the hardest sin resource to fit in this team. I just couldn't find an open slot for it in my preferred team setup. It's also perfectly reasonable to bring 4th Match Flame over Red Eyes Open if you wanted to focus harder on burn, plus it deals much higher single target damage than Red Eyes Open. If you wanted other ego that inflicts burn, your options are pretty limited. Yisang's 4th Match Flame is an AoE by default and inflicts a small amount of burn, but is pretty expensive for what it does in my opinion, and is for some reason the only ego that doesn't increase on power on being thread spun to level 3. You could also bring any variant of Don Quixote if you wanted to use Lifetime Stew for high single target damage and the ability to inflict burn count, even though Don Quixote doesn't have a burn ID for herself yet. Speaking of Don Quixote, She Association Don Quixote is not a bad inclusion if you wanted to fuel Ardor Blossom's Star and Red Eyes Open more quickly, but it will force you to have other IDs to be more focused on building the resources you need otherwise instead of inflicting burn. The Liu IDs also synergize really well with most of the N-Corp IDs due to their overlap in sin resource generation. The most helpful ones in my opinion are N-Rhodia, since she fuels her own 4th Match Flame well and has decent damage output, and the one who shall grip Sinclair because of his heavy damage output and ability to inflict burn and generate gloom resources. Plus, Sinclair has the ability to use Impending Day to generate a lot of resources quickly and power himself up. And I guess Lifetime Stew's passive lets him inflict more burn, but like, why would you run that? And that's about all I have to say about Limbus Company's Liu Association identities. I hope you found this little overview helpful or enjoyable, and encourage you to play around with these IDs. I'm a big fan of them personally, and once there's more burn support, I'm sure they'll be able to hold their own against tougher enemies. Feel free to leave a comment about what teams you like bringing the Liu IDs into, and to suggest which faction I should tackle next. Also consider liking the video and subscribing, as it helps me out a lot. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you back for the next video. Bye bye!